The rain came down in sheets, hammering against the windows of the old cabin nestled deep in the woods. I hadn't expected the storm to be this fierce when I decided to spend the weekend here. The plan was simple. Escape the noise of the city, clear my head and maybe find some peace. But now, as I sat by the dim glow of the fireplace, listening to the howling wind outside, I felt anything but peaceful. The cabin creaked with every gust of wind, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed to dance on the walls, playing tricks on my mind. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. It wasn't just the storm. It was the weight of everything I had been running from. Just as I was about to pour myself another glass of wine, there was a knock at the door. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but then it came again, louder this time. My heart jumped. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere during a storm like this? I hesitated, staring at the door. The knock came again, more insistent now. Slowly, I stood and made my way over, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath my feet. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No response. I hesitated for a moment longer before unlocking the door and cracking it open. The wind immediately pushed against it, sending a cold spray of rain into my face. Standing there on the porch was a man, drenched from head to toe, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. His clothes clung to him, and he looked like he'd been walking for miles. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, his voice rough and strained. "My car broke down a few miles back. I've been walking for hours, and this was the only light I saw." I stared at him, unsure of what to say. He looked harmless enough, but there was something about the situation that made me uneasy. Still, I couldn't just leave him out there in the storm. "Come in," I said finally, stepping aside to let him in. "Thank you," he said, stepping over the threshold. Water dripped onto the floor as he entered, and he shivered visibly. I closed the door behind him and gestured toward the fire. "You can warm up over there. I'll grab you a towel." "Thanks," he said again, his voice softer now. As he moved toward the fireplace, I hurried to the small bathroom and grabbed a towel. When I returned, he was standing by the fire, his hands outstretched toward the flames. He turned as I approached, taking the towel from me with a grateful smile. "I'm Ethan," he said, drying his face and hair. "Claire," I replied, still studying him carefully. "Thank you, Claire. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't let me in." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Do you want something to drink? Coffee? There. Tea would be great," he said, his voice warming slightly. I moved to the kitchen, still feeling a little on edge. As I boiled water and prepared the tea, I couldn't help but glance over at him. He was standing by the fire, his back to me, staring into the flames. There was something about the way he stood, so still, so quiet, that made me uneasy. When the tea was ready, I brought it over to him. He took the cup with a nod of thanks and sat down on the couch. I sat in the armchair across from him, pulling the blanket back over myself. "So," I began, trying to make conversation, "what brings you out here?" "I was on my way to visit some friends," he said, blowing on the tea before taking a sip. "I didn't realize how bad the weather was going to get. My car just gave out a few miles back. No cell service out here, of course, so I started walking." I nodded, though his explanation didn't do much to ease my nerves. "Where are your friends?" "About an hour's drive from here. I was hoping to make it there before the storm hit, but..." He trailed off, gesturing toward the window. The wind howled again, rattling the windows. I shivered, pulling the blanket tighter. "Well, you're welcome to stay here until the storm passes," I said, though the words felt strange coming out of my mouth. Inviting a stranger to stay in my cabin wasn't exactly something I'd ever imagined myself doing. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I really appreciate it." For a while we sat in silence, the only sounds coming from the crackling fire and the storm outside. I couldn't stop glancing at him, trying to figure him out. There was something about him that didn't quite add up, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. "So Claire," he said suddenly, breaking the silence, "what about you? What brings you out here?" I hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Just needed to get away," I said finally. "From what?" I looked at him, surprised by the directness of his question. Sometimes it's good to get away. Clear your head. Yeah, I said, though I wasn't sure if it was working. The silence returned heavier this time. I could feel his eyes on me, studying me the way I had been studying him. Do you live out here? He asked after a while. No, it's just a rental, I said. I found it online. Thought it would be nice to spend a weekend in the woods. He nodded again, his expression unreadable. It's a nice place. Yeah, I said, though at the moment it didn't feel so nice. The storm raged on outside, and I found myself wishing it would pass quickly. Something about Ethan's presence unsettled me, though I couldn't figure out why. He hadn't done anything wrong. If anything, he seemed polite and grateful. But there was a tension in the air that I couldn't ignore. As the night wore on, the fire began to die down. I stood to add more wood, but Ethan beat me to it. Let me, he said, grabbing a log and placing it on the embers. Thanks, I murmured, sitting back down. He turned to me, his gaze steady. You don't have to be afraid of me, you know. I blinked, startled by his words. I'm not afraid of you, I said quickly, though I wasn't sure if it was true. He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're a terrible liar. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. The fire crackled, filling the silence between us. I could feel my pulse quickening, though I wasn't sure why. There was something about the way he looked at me, like he could see right through me. Thank you again for letting me in, he said after a while, his voice softer now. I know it's not easy to trust a stranger. It's fine, I said, though my voice sounded weak even to me. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer before he turned back to the fire. I sat there staring at the flames, trying to ignore the unease that had settled deep in my chest. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and for the first time since I arrived at the cabin, I wished I hadn't come at all. The storm showed no signs of easing. The relentless pounding of rain against the windows made it hard to think clearly. Ethan had settled back into the couch, staring into the fire as if lost in thought. I tried to focus on the warmth of the flames, on the crackling of the wood, but my mind kept drifting back to him. There was something about his presence that felt off. Not threatening exactly, but unsettling. Do you think your car will still be there by morning? I asked, breaking the silence. Ethan turned his head toward me, his expression calm. I hope so. I left it on the side of the road, but with this rain, who knows? It might be flooded by now. I nodded, unsure of what else to say. The words felt hollow, like small talk meant to fill the space between us. But the space didn't feel empty. It felt charged, like there was something unsaid hanging in the air. Do you come out here often? He asked, his voice casual. No, I replied, shaking my head. This is my first time. I thought it would be peaceful. And is it? He tilted his head slightly, studying me. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Not exactly, I admitted. He smiled faintly, but again it didn't reach his eyes. I get it. Sometimes, even when you're far away from everything, your thoughts have a way of catching up to you. I looked at him, surprised by the insight in his words. Yeah, I said softly. Something like that. For a moment, the tension between us seemed to ease. He leaned back against the couch, cradling the cup of tea in his hands, and I allowed myself to relax just a little. Maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe he was just a guy who got unlucky with the storm and needed a place to stay. But then he spoke again, and the unease returned. You know, he said, his tone conversational. It's funny how people always assume they're safe when they're alone. Like being isolated means nothing bad can happen. I frowned, my grip on the blanket tightening. What do you mean? He shrugged, taking a sip of his tea. Just that being out here in the middle of nowhere. It's not exactly the safest place to be. Anything could happen and no one would know. My heart skipped a beat. That's a strange thing to say. He glanced at me, his expression unreadable. Is it? I'm just being realistic. You're out here all alone, no neighbors for miles, no cell service. If something went wrong, how would anyone find you? I stared at him, my pulse quickening. Was he trying to scare me? Or was he just making an observation? Either way, I didn't like where this conversation was going. Well, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, I've got the storm to keep me company. And now you apparently. He chuckled softly, but there was no warmth in the sound. Lucky me, he said, setting his empty cup on the table. The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed. I could feel his eyes on me again, and I fought the urge to look away. Instead, I stood gathering the empty cups. I'll get these cleaned up, I said, my voice a little too bright. Let me help, he offered, standing as well. No, it's fine, I said quickly, stepping toward the kitchen. He didn't argue, but I could feel him watching me as I walked away. In the small kitchen, I set the cups in the sink and gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady my breathing. I needed to calm down. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a stranger who needed help. I was letting my imagination run wild. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I returned to the living room, Ethan was standing by the window, looking out into the storm. His back was to me, and for a moment I considered turning around and going back to the kitchen. But then he spoke. Do you ever feel like someone's watching you? He asked, his voice low. I froze, the words sending a chill down my spine. What? He turned to face me, his expression serious. Out here in the woods. It's so quiet, so isolated. Sometimes it feels like there's someone out there, watching. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. I haven't noticed anything like that, I said, though my voice betrayed me. He studied me for a moment, then smiled faintly. Maybe it's just the storm playing tricks on my mind. Maybe, I said, forcing a smile. He moved away from the window and sat back down on the couch, but I couldn't shake the unease his words had left behind. I sat in the armchair again, pulling the blanket tightly around me, and tried to focus on the fire. For a while, neither of us spoke. The storm raged on outside, and the tension in the room seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. I wanted to ask him more about his car, about his friends, about why he was really out here, but I didn't. I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answers. Eventually, Ethan broke the silence. You're not very good at hiding your emotions, are you? He said, his tone light but his words cutting. I looked at him, startled. What do you mean? You've been on edge since I got here, he said, leaning back against the couch. I can see it in your eyes. You don't trust me. I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. He was right, I didn't trust him. I'm just not used to having company out here, I said finally. He nodded, as if he understood. Fair enough. But you don't have to worry about me, Claire. I'm not here to hurt you. The way he said it made my stomach twist. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it, like he was trying to convince me of something I didn't believe. I know, I said, though the words felt hollow. He smiled faintly, then turned his attention back to the fire. I watched him for a moment longer, then stood. I think I'm going to call it a night, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Ethan looked up at me, his expression unreadable. Sure. I'll just stay here and keep an eye on the fire. Okay, I said, hesitating for a moment before heading toward the bedroom. As I closed the door behind me, I let out a shaky breath. My hands were trembling, and I couldn't tell if it was from fear or adrenaline. I leaned against the door, listening to the sound of the fire crackling in the other room, and tried to make sense of my feelings. Ethan hadn't done anything wrong, at least not overtly. But there was something about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, that made me uneasy. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was letting my imagination get the better of me. But as I climbed into bed and pulled the covers over me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The storm outside continued to rage, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, I had made a mistake letting Ethan in. I barely slept that night. The storm outside didn't help, but it wasn't the thunder or the wind that kept me awake. It was the thought of Ethan sitting just a few feet away in the living room. Every creak of the cabin, every shifting shadow, made my heart race. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that he was just a stranded traveler looking for help. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the unease wouldn't go away. At some point, exhaustion finally won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke, the storm had calmed, leaving behind only the faint sound of dripping water from the eaves. Pale morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a grayish glow over the room. For a moment I lay there trying to gather my thoughts. Maybe things would feel different in the daylight. Maybe I'd laugh at myself for being so paranoid. But when I opened the bedroom door and stepped into the living room, I found Ethan standing by the window again, staring out into the woods. He didn't notice me at first, and I took the opportunity to study him. His posture was tense, his shoulders rigid, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. He looked like he was waiting for something, or someone. "Good morning," I said, my voice breaking the silence. He turned to face me, his expression softening. "Morning. Did you sleep well?" "Not really," I admitted, moving toward the kitchen. "The storm kept me up." He nodded, his gaze following me as I walked. "Yeah, it was a rough night." I busied myself making coffee, trying to ignore the way his presence seemed to fill the room. "Did you sleep at all?" I asked over my shoulder. "A little," he said. The couch was comfortable enough. I poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to him. He took it with a small smile, but his eyes lingered on mine a moment too long. I quickly turned away, sipping my coffee and pretending to focus on the view outside the window. The woods were still shrouded in mist, the trees dripping with rainwater. It should have been peaceful, but instead, it felt oppressive. "So what's the plan?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Are you going to head back to your car?" "Yeah," he said, though there was a hesitation in his voice. "I'll walk back and see if it's still there. Hopefully, it'll start, and I can get out of your hair." "Do you need a ride?" I offered, though the thought of being alone in a car with him made my stomach twist. He shook his head. "No, I don't want to trouble you. Besides, I could use the walk." I nodded, relieved but also uneasy. "Okay. Just let me know if you need anything before you go." "Thanks," he said, his voice soft. We fell into an awkward silence, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. I kept glancing at the clock, counting the minutes until he would leave. But Ethan didn't seem to be in any hurry. He sipped his coffee slowly, his eyes drifting back to the window. I wondered what he was thinking about, what he was waiting for. Finally, he set his mug down and looked at me. "Claire, can I ask you something?" I hesitated, my grip tightening on my own mug. "Sure. Why are you really out here?" His voice was calm, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made my heart race. "I told you," I said, forcing a smile. "I needed to get away." "From what?" He pressed. I looked down at my coffee, the warmth of the mug seeping into my hands. "Just life," I said quietly. "Work, people, everything. I needed some space to think." He nodded, as if he understood. "It's hard, isn't it? Feeling like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." I glanced up at him, surprised by the empathy in his voice. "Yeah," I admitted. "It is." For a moment, the tension between us seemed to ease. He leaned back against the counter, his expression thoughtful. "I get it," he said. "Sometimes, it feels like no matter how far you run, you can't escape what's inside your own head." "Exactly," I said, surprised by how much his words resonated with me. He smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in his eyes that I couldn't ignore. "I guess we're not so different, you and I." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. Instead, I turned my attention back to the window, watching as the mist slowly began to lift. The woods looked less menacing in the daylight, but the unease in my chest hadn't gone away. After a while, Ethan stood and stretched. "I should probably get going," he said. "Thank you again for letting me stay. I really appreciate it." "You're welcome," I said, though the words felt strange. "Do you need anything before you go? Food? Water?" "No, I'm good," he said, grabbing his jacket from the back of the couch. "I'll be fine." I walked him to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As he stepped outside, he turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "Take care of yourself, Claire," he said. "And be careful out here." I frowned, his words sending a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing. Just take care." With that, he turned and walked down the porch steps, disappearing into the mist. I stood there for a moment watching him go, before closing the door and locking it behind me. The cabin felt eerily quiet without him, but instead of feeling relieved, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I tried to go about my day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see Ethan standing there watching me. But the woods were empty, the only movement coming from the swaying branches in the breeze. By midday, the rain had stopped completely, and the sun began to peek through the clouds. I decided to go for a walk, hoping the fresh air would clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cool, damp air wrapping around me. The ground was muddy, the leaves slick with rainwater, but the woods felt calmer now, less threatening. As I walked, I tried to push thoughts of Ethan out of my mind. Maybe I was overthinking everything. Maybe he really was just a stranded traveler, and I was letting my paranoia get the best of me. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he'd let on. I followed the narrow trail that wound through the trees, the sound of my footsteps muffled by the wet earth. The woods were quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It should have been peaceful, but instead it felt wrong. I don't know how long I walked before I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a dark shape among the trees. But as I got closer, I realized it was a car. Ethan's car. It was parked haphazardly on the side of the trail, the front end slightly tilted into a ditch. The hood was open, and the engine looked like it had been tampered with. My stomach dropped. If his car was here, then why had he been walking for hours last night? Why hadn't he mentioned that it was so close to the cabin? I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The car was empty, but the driver's side door was slightly ajar. Inside, the seats were damp, as if they'd been exposed to the rain. There was no sign of Ethan, or anyone else. A chill ran down my spine as I stood there, staring at the car. Something wasn't right. Something was very, very wrong. And then, from somewhere deep in the woods, I heard it. A faint rustling sound like someone moving through the trees. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, closer, and I turned, my eyes scanning the forest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I took a step back, my heart racing. The woods felt suddenly oppressive, the trees closing in around me. I turned and started walking back toward the cabin, my pace quickening with each step. The sound of rustling followed me, growing louder, more insistent. By the time I reached the cabin, I was running. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The silence inside was deafening, but outside, I could still hear it, the faint sound of someone moving through the woods. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I stood there, staring at the door, my hands trembling. I didn't know what was going on, but one thing was clear. Ethan hadn't told me the whole truth, and now I wasn't sure if I was safe anymore. The cabin was silent now, save for the faint crackling of the dying fire in the hearth. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I stood in the center of the living room, clutching the knife I had grabbed from the kitchen. My hands were trembling, but I gripped it tightly, the cold steel grounding me in the chaos of my thoughts. Ethan was out there, somewhere, watching. I had seen him, just minutes ago, through the window. His silhouette had been unmistakable, standing at the edge of the woods, half shrouded in shadow. He hadn't moved, hadn't called out, just stood there staring at the cabin. And then, as quickly as he'd appeared, he was gone. What did he want? Why had he come back? I didn't have answers, only the gnawing fear in my gut that told me I was in danger. I tried to think rationally, to piece together everything that had happened since he'd shown up at my door. His car, so conveniently close to the cabin. His strange questions. The way he'd lingered, as if he was waiting for something. And now this. I turned toward the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. I had to get out of here. Staying in the cabin felt like a trap, like I was a cornered animal waiting to be caught. But where could I go? The woods were vast, endless, and I didn't know them well enough to navigate in the dark. And if Ethan was out there, the thought made my stomach twist. A sudden noise broke through my thoughts, a soft creak, like a footstep on the porch. My breath hitched and I spun toward the sound, the knife raised in front of me. The door rattled slightly, as if someone was testing the handle. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I took a shaky step back, my eyes darting toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could feel the weight of the darkness outside pressing against the glass. Another creak, louder this time. My grip on the knife tightened. "Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Still nothing. And then suddenly the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, more unnerving than the noise itself. I strained to listen, every muscle in my body tense. But there was nothing, no footsteps, no movement, just the faint sound of the wind outside. I didn't know how long I stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. Minutes? Hours? Time felt meaningless in the suffocating stillness of the cabin. Finally, I forced myself to move, to do something other than stand there like a frightened child. I crept toward the door, my bare feet silent against the wooden floor. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. Slowly, I reached for the lock, my fingers trembling. I had to see. I had to know if he was still there. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and cracked it open just enough to peek outside. The porch was empty. The woods beyond were dark and still. The mist from earlier now replaced by an eerie, almost unnatural quiet. But something wasn't right. The air felt wrong, heavy with a tension I couldn't explain. I stepped onto the porch, the knife still clutched tightly in my hand. My eyes scanned the treeline, searching for any sign of movement. "Ethan," I called out, my voice echoing into the night. "If you're out there, just tell me what you want." Silence. And then from somewhere deep in the woods I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound. Laughter. Low and guttural, like it was coming from someone who was trying to hold it back. My blood turned to ice. I backed toward the door, my legs trembling. "This isn't funny," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. "Just leave me alone." The laughter stopped. For a moment I thought maybe I had imagined it, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But then from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. It was quick, almost too quick to register. But it was there. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and bolted back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the door, the knife trembling in my hand. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. But where could I go? The car was parked a mile down the road, and I wasn't sure I could make it that far. Not with him out there. The phone. The thought hit me like a lightning bolt. There was an old landline in the cabin, mounted on the wall near the kitchen. I had tried it earlier, but the storm had knocked out the connection. Maybe it was working now. Maybe I could call for help. I ran to the kitchen, my bare feet skidding slightly on the floor. The phone was still there, its black receiver hanging limply from the cradle. I grabbed it and pressed it to my ear, my heart sinking when I heard nothing but static. "Come on," I whispered, jiggling the cord as if that would somehow fix it. "Please work." The static crackled, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard a voice, a faint, distant whisper. I froze, straining to hear it. "Claire." My blood ran cold. I dropped the phone, the receiver clattering against the wall. The whisper had been unmistakable. It was my name. Someone had said my name. The lights flickered, plunging the cabin into brief darkness before the dim glow returned. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight with panic. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, I headed for the back door. If I could make it to the road, maybe I could flag down a passing car. Or at least put some distance between myself and whatever or whoever was out there. I opened the back door slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The night air was cold and damp, and the flashlight's beam barely cut through the darkness. I stepped outside, my heart pounding in my ears. The woods loomed around me, their shadows twisting and shifting in the weak light. I forced myself to move, one step at a time, the knife still clutched tightly in my other hand. And then I saw him. Ethan was standing just a few feet away, his face partially obscured by the shadows. His expression was calm, almost serene, but there was something in his eyes that made my stomach churn. "Claire," he said softly, his voice carrying easily through the still night. "You shouldn't be out here." I took a step back, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. I just want to help you, he said. You're all alone out here. It's not safe. Stay away from me, I said, my voice rising. He took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. I'm not going to hurt you, he said, his tone almost soothing. But you need to come with me. It's the only way. The only way to what? I asked, my grip tightening on the knife. To make it out of here, he said, his eyes locking onto mine. You don't understand, Claire. You're not alone in these woods. There's something else out here. Something worse. I stared at him, my mind racing. Was he telling the truth? Or was this just another game, another way to manipulate me? Before I could respond, a sound erupted from the woods behind him. A low guttural growl that made my blood run cold. Ethan's expression changed instantly, his calm demeanor replaced by something I hadn't seen before, fear. Run, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. For a moment I stood there, frozen, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. But the growl came again, louder this time, and I didn't wait to hear it a third time. I turned and ran, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted back toward the cabin. I didn't know what was out there. I didn't know if Ethan was lying, or if he was trying to save me. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. The cabin came into view, its faint light a beacon in the darkness. I stumbled up the porch steps, throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind me. My chest heaved as I locked the door, my back pressed against it. For now I was safe. But deep down I knew this wasn't over.